Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the latest in the New Books in the Arts and Sciences series here at the Society of Fellows and Heyman Center for the Humanities. And tonight we're celebrating recent work by Dustin Stewart. His first book, Futures of Enlightenment Poetry, which came out from Oxford University Press late in 2020, and a thing of great beauty. My name's Alan Stewart, no relation, and I'm the chair of the Department of English and Comparative Literature. This event is also sponsored by the Office of the Divisional Deans in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and the Department of English and Comparative Literature. And we want to thank Eileen Galuli, Kelly McKinney, and Kei Zhang for all their work behind the scenes. The way that this evening will work is that I will introduce our speakers quite briefly, and then we'll hear from Dustin about his book, and then each of our panelists will provide a response. Dustin will then have a chance to respond to the responses, and we can then open up to the Q&A to everyone out there. When we get to that stage, I'll remind you how to do this, but if you wish to ask a question, please just type it into the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. And if you wish to, I can either read the question out for you. If you want to deliver it yourself, just put the word live somewhere, and I will call on you at that point, and we'll patch you into the broadcast, as it were. Okay, Dustin Stewart is assistant professor of English and comparative literature at Columbia, specializing in the literature and culture of the later 17th and 18th centuries, with broader interests in poetics and theology. Futures of Enlightenment Poetry, the reason we're here tonight, is his first book. His next long-term project will explore the concept of the parish and the writing of local identity in the British Atlantic world. And an article on Black Calvinism and Afro-pessimism will appear in ELH later this year. Sophie G is Associate Chair of the English Department at Princeton, specializing in 17th and 18th century British literature and the colonial 18th century world. She's currently finishing a book titled The Barbarous Feast, Sacrifice, Migration, and Eating in the 18th century world, about the many meanings that surround ritual eating in the period. She's also finishing another novel titled Mysteries of the Invisible World, about 18th century science, ghosts, gold mines, textiles, time travel, and true love. And the pandemic year has prompted Sophie to launch a new endeavor called the Mindful Humanities Project, focusing on the effectiveness of mindfulness and other embodied practices in teaching and criticism. Julie Crawford is the Mark Van Doren Professor of Humanities at Columbia. She works on 16th and 17th century English literature and culture, especially post-Reformation religious culture, the history of reading, and the history of sexuality. She's the author of two books, Marvelous Protestantism in 2005 and Mediatrix in 2014, and is currently completing a third book entitled Margaret Cavendish's Political Career. And Christopher Brown is Professor of History at Columbia. He specializes in the history of 18th century Britain, the early modern British Empire, and the comparative history of slavery and abolition. He's the author of two books, Moral Capital, Foundations of British Abolitionism, 2006, and Arming Slaves from the Classical Era to the Modern Age, also 2006, and is now at work on two projects, one on British experience along the West African coast in the era of the Atlantic slave trade, and a second on the decline and fall of the British planter class in the era of abolition and emancipation. Welcome to all our speakers, and I'm going to hand over to Dustin.
Thanks to all of you who are here or there. Thanks to my fellow panelists. Thanks to Alan for introducing us. Thanks to SOF Heyman for making this event possible, specifically to Kelly McKinney and Kei Zhang for careful, thoughtful work that makes these events possible. Can a poem make you feel like you've died and gone to heaven or someplace better? Can it give you somehow mental or spiritual practice for the afterlife, for the world to come? Some poets in Enlightenment England dared to think so, even though this isn't the sort of speculation we tend to associate with their period. Yet these poets disagreed, just as theologians had long disagreed, about what that future state would be like. The poets worked out strongly contrasting visions of a future made present in verse. One vision plays up the Christian idea of the body's resurrection, while the other emphasizes the soul's immortality. My big point in this book, though, isn't just that these two models are different, are incompatible even. It's that each one gets its momentum by having the other one to reject. A poetry of bodily resurrection needs to leave the disembodied soul behind, and a poetry of the disembodied soul needs to consign the body and its time to the past. That's a 1-minute summary of Futures of Enlightenment Poetry, my 300-page book. A bit about the book's origins and its structure might be helpful before you hear several different responses. I want to organize these thoughts in moving from one word, rhythm, to another word, source. So from rhythm to source. My initial problem 8-9 years ago, and what became a 9-year process, was that I found John Milton, the poet with whom I began, to be a kind of materialist in philosophical and theological terms. Certainly the critics and scholars whose work was influential for me emphasized Milton's materialist view of reality. But I also found that his self-proclaimed heirs in the 18th century, so some mid-18th century poets, Edward Young is my main guy, but some others too, such as Elizabeth Singer Rowe and Mark Akenside. These were poets writing writing poetry that struck me as recognizably Miltonic in its style, in its themes and topics, its ambitions. And yet they used that poetry to work out a theological vision that was strongly counter-materialist, that resisted the kind of outlook that I had come to see as decisive for Milton. This recognition of a problem, this disconnect between what I saw Milton doing and what his self-styled heirs were doing between 50 and 70 years later after Milton's death, raised some questions for me of literary history. How, for example, was Milton rebranded in these intervening years? What effort did it take? What work was involved? It also raised questions for me of intellectual history. How did these mid-18th century poets with their souls soaring out into space fit with understandings of Enlightenment that, as far as I could tell, emphasized the tangible, the secular, the provable, the material? Were they Enlightenment figures or maybe counter-Enlightenment figures? The resolution I came to my problem took me back to Milton. Maybe the right approach wasn't simply to say that Milton is timelessly a materialist, that he, present tense, denies the idea of a soul that can detach from a body. Maybe I thought, with a kind of change of perspective, maybe the point is that he came to reject that idea, having thought otherwise earlier in life, and that's true. Looking at it this way, again, it's just a slight change in perspective, means that an emphasis on resurrection can be seen as part of a pattern or a rhythm, a step that comes after a prior emphasis on souls and immortality. This is a rhythm I came to think that could be long or short. It could stretch out across a lifetime of spiritual searching, or it could be compressed into the space of a single short poem. I also determined that this rhythm, as I was calling it, could be reversible in devotional or poetic practice, and I tend to treat the two as interchangeable for some of these writers. In devotional or poetic practice, you can take that pattern and turn it the other way. You could start with a stress on the body and embodiment, and then you could move to a different kind of stress on a detachable soul, a soul that escapes the body and gains new power as a result. This recognition, the sense that maybe the thing I was talking about could be understood as a pattern and also a reversible pattern, helped me to place my mid-18th century poets in relation to Milton, who came before, and to the kind of materialism that became ascendant in Restoration England and was on the march, culturally speaking, in the early years of the 18th century. but it also eventually helped me to make sense of what historically came after the mid-18th century poets. For these figures, Young and Akenside especially, aren't just post-Miltonic writers. When critics talk about them at all, which isn't very often in my view, they tend to talk about them as pre-Romantic figures of a sort. So they're in the middle, they're after Milton, but before Romanticism. And then it sort of struck me, and just as Protestant theologians kept needing to place the soul's disembodied life in between two phases of embodied existence, right? You have life on one side, resurrection on the other. The soul's disembodied state is in between. So literary history needs to place these poets of disembodiment in a kind of middle, in a kind of intermediate state between Milton on the one side and Romantics on the other. I follow this chronology in the major sections of the book. The last two chapters consider major Romantic writers who, as I argue, bring the 18th century poets and their detached souls back down to the earth, back down to the body. They domesticate them, as I say in the book, but I want to resist the idea that they simply contain them. I use the introduction and the final chapter in particular to suggest that a disembodied poetics just refuses to stay comfortably locked away in the cultural past. It keeps wanting to reemerge. It keeps wanting to reemerge even among Anglo-American poets writing today in the early 21st century. All of this left me, finishing the book, left me with a richer idea of what a source can be, a more complicated idea of what a source can be. Sure, it's something you can carry with you from an old context into a new one and putting it to new purposes. The 18th century poets did that with Milton, and then the Romantic poets in their turn did that with their 18th century predecessors. Yeah, that's a version of what a source can be. But I came to think that what you run from, what you do your best to escape, is also a kind of source. Obviously, I came to think about this in personal as well as literary and historical terms. That thing that you're trying to break away from, that's part of your rhythm too. That step has its necessary place in your rhythm, its necessary part to play in shaping the futures that are possible for you, futures that remain far away, or maybe futures that can be imagined right now, experienced in advance. I'm excited to hear what others thought of the book.
Thank you very much. And now over to Sophie G. You're muted.
Thanks so much, Alan, and congratulations, Dustin. What an achievement. And thank you everybody at the Heyman Center for organizing this event, which is a wonderful opportunity to come together. And it's an honor to talk about 18th century matters with this group. So thank you. So as I was reading this fabulously learned, wide-ranging monograph, it struck me that two kind of big picture interventions rose to the surface for me. And they were these. The first has to do, I think, with the afterlife of religion itself, Protestantism's futurity and its relation to our own lived modernity, our own sense now of what embodiment is and what it can do. And this for me was a reminder that Anglo-American civic and secular ideologies are deeply bound still to debates and theological disputes in Protestant culture, even when that fact is ignored or elided, disappeared or misrepresented. And I was reminded, or I was reflecting on the fact that secular culture can be, often is, paradoxically, another way of naming Protestant culture, because it's in relation to Protestant religion that the concept of secularism in England emerged. And the point I was reflecting on here is that Protestant Anglo-American culture is the culture of domination and supremacy, and its attitudes to embodiment and also of disembodiment were formed during the 18th century, when England's primary focus was on expanding empire and controlling a vastly diffuse, wide-ranging array of subjects and bodies that existed across the 18th century imperial world, including in England. And this reflection, in turn, reminded me that about the constructed and strategic quality of secularity itself. The idea of something being secular in the Anglo-American world really only exists as a way of consigning other things, ideas, people, habits of thought and conduct, to being religious. So I was reminded, for example, of the observation in I think it's the 2013 essay by Talal Assad, Wendy Brown and Sabah Mahmood, Is Critique Secular? Where they point out that concepts of religion and secularity always exist in, as they say, a linked series of constitutive oppositions: secularism, religion, critique, orthodoxy, reason, belief, judgment, obedience, truth, faith, transparency, opacity. And there tends to be a good and a bad in that. So I was very struck as I read your book, Dustin, by your commitment, its intellectual commitment to recoupling secularity and religion in the period, recoupling critique and orthodoxy in the 18th century world, and thereby asking us to reconceptualize imaginative freedom under the umbrella of religion, under the umbrella of involuntary belief. I thought you wrote really beautifully about the ways in which 18th century poetry seeks to, this is you, not me, narrow the gap between this world and the next. And you're pinpointing that to the issue of embodiment, I found very powerful. And I think it's correct to say that the arguments of the book are built on the basic perception that there exist two contradictory paths in 18th century Protestant theology of the resurrection. The one is the soul's immortality, and the other is the whole body's resurrection, or I guess this is theology of salvation. And you point out that this frames an irreconcilable problem for 18th century theology. The quote from the book is, "You can't want a body and want to lose it at the same time," which, as a summary of the dilemmas and the deep contradictions of 18th century imaginative writing, that seemed pretty spot on to me, not just in poetry, but kind of across the board. So in your account, disagreement about the nature of the afterlife becomes a disagreement about what poetry is like. And this drives some wonderful readings, ranging from your beautiful work on the son in Paradise Regained, who lives in a kind of permanent present. You say his education has to remain unfinished and ongoing, which kind of made me laugh because it sort of sounds like graduate school. And then you had that delightful chapter on Elizabeth Singer Rowe and Frances, Countess of Hertford, where you argue that the opposite of materiality, the spiritualization of a future, is a way for them to evade the body and its constraints. It gives them a freedom from what you call exemplary femininity. And then there's a really fascinating chapter on extraction and the poetics of extraction in the mid-century. And you rightly identify extraction as a logic that extended across the imperial world from theology to imperial trade. Gold was extracted in the same manner and through the same Protestant logic that souls were. And I found that chapter to be a really nice way of recognizing the aggressive implications, the necessarily imperial implications of Protestant theology in the period. There's a huge sweep of writers in the book. It's a wonderful achievement. So I guess I wanted to sort of move to two reflections that I also had as I read. One is that the question brooding over the book, which you explicitly address in several places, is what all this means for those who did not have Protestant bodies or souls. And in the 18th century world, it was a radical and also frequently an unnamed or an unacknowledged form of disembodiment, because to be without a Protestant body or a soul effectively meant being without a body at all and having a soul that can't be seen. And as you recognize, that is hugely important because it invites us to reflect on the fact that the Protestant dilemma over body and spirit, this very intricate series of theological debates that you tease out so meticulously, that very enmeshment in theological debate was itself often a way to exclude or refuse embodiment and futurity to colonized subjects, to enslaved people, to occupied indigenous people, and in fact, anyone within England who didn't, for whatever reason, put themselves into the mainstream spectrum of religious belief. So there's another sort of important piece in this, I think, which is that Protestant theologies of the afterlife, the claim that a person's future state either depends on shedding their body or gaining a newly resurrected, perfected body, meant in turn, potentially, that earthly bodies, really whichever side of the debate you belong to, earthly bodies could themselves be regarded either as disposable, not relevant to salvation, or mere precursors or placeholders to futurity. So in this scenario then, which is, I think, always implied but often unnamed, presence sensations in the present, suffering in the present, feeling in the present, can actually be disregarded as theologically unimportant because it is peripheral to salvation. And that feels very important when we think about 18th century suffering across the world, across the empire, and the sense that the body which experiences it can be constructed as a body that doesn't matter, whose embodiment is not central. So this, I'm going to finish in about a minute. This led me to recognize that in this constellation that you're giving us in the book, presence becomes a very vexed side, being present, being in presence. The present becomes a place that we need to do something with, make something of, form a critique of it, form a judgment of it, initiate a sublime imaginative flight from it. We need, in other words, in the 18th century frequently to transform presence into a future rather than to experience it as presence. And then my last thought before I finish is that I realized, you helped me put my finger on something, which is that in Christianity, and especially in Protestantism, I think, the individual's own body is made complicated by always also being the body of another. And that other is Christ, but it's also, by extension and by kind of theological implication, the body of other Christians. And this has really interesting implications for the 18th century and 18th century writing, where the depiction of sympathetic identification is so important, the evolution of sympathy. And because it helped me to think about the idea that there's this underlying claim that we're sympathetically connected to one another because we effectively share bodies through Christ's substitutory atonement. And a kind of related point then is that bodies can surrogate for one another, can be substituted for one another in these logics. And you know, this idea of sort of bodies and their relationship to one another through theology, Protestant theologies, gives us a much more limited sense of our own capacity to possess our own body in the period and sort of now, and rather too expanded a suggestion that we are licensed to possess other people's bodies. And again, for me, that raised the problem of not being Christian, not being Protestant, when you were nonetheless pulled, usually involuntarily, into this economy of bodily possession and sympathetic identification through the network of colonization in the period. So that's what I had to say. Thank you for your wonderful book. And I'm going to remute.
Thank you very much. And now Julie Crawford.
Hi, I guessed on the basis of biographies what people will be talking about. So far I'm doing well. And so I'm going to talk about poetry, and I'm also going to talk about the speculative. So one of my CC students, I was reading a little bit of Margaret Cavendish and actually Lucy Hutchinson's translation of Lucretius when we were doing Enlightenment in the Age of Science. And one of my students started calling it the ideas that didn't win. She's like, I want more of the ideas that didn't win. And I've been thinking about that a lot. So there's always a moment or two when teaching Milton when there is a simultaneously thrilling and slightly embarrassing moment as students encounter Milton's angels. First, in book 1, when Raphael says that spirits, when they please, can either sex assume or both. So soft and uncompounded is their essence pure, nor tied or manacles with joint or limb, nor founded on the brittle strength of bones like cumbrous flesh, but in what shape they choose, dilated or condensed, bright or obscure, can execute their airy purposes and works of love or enmity fulfilled. It gets even heightened when they encounter the idea that spirits can, as they please, limn themselves and color, shape, or size assume as likes them best. And then they really reach a pitch when they get to angel sex. Let it suffice thee, says Raphael, the very sexy angel who is phoenix-like and dressed in sort of a rainbow loincloth. Let it suffice thee that thou knowest us happy, and without love no happiness. Whatever pure thou in the body enjoyest, and pure thou wert created, we enjoy in eminence. An obstacle find none of membrane, joint, or limb, exclusive bars. It goes on and it's really good, but there is always this sort of thrilling moment. And it's thrilling because students always pull up short at this moment. It's never not happened in my many years of teaching Milton. It's why I keep on teaching Milton. Where one student said, literally refusing to leave the page of the poem for a moment, or actually the space of the classroom, saying really adamantly, can we just stay here? Stop here for a moment. Can we just revel in this? And then embarrassing because it feels too speculative, or it feels too theological, or it feels too transmaterial in a way that makes them feel uncomfortable about drawing their attention away from the ways that bodies with sexes, including trans sexes, are violently materially punished in the real world for being embodied in the way that they're embodied. Or that they see the encounter between theology, whether dualist body-soul or mortalist body with soul, and what to them is a more comfortable, because more aligned with secularity, mode of thinking that is vitalist materialism, which is also deeply thrilling, I find, for students. Milton's much vaunted one first matter all, and its promise that all created beings are different from one another only in degree rather than kind, a theory that is much more amenable to their queer and of color and eco-critical and non-human exceptionalist sensibilities, right? So it becomes sort of an encounter always between theoretical comfort zones. So your book, should I say you or Dustin? I'll say you because I'm looking at you. So your book offers us another way of thinking about these scenes. And this is what it's most exciting for me, of thinking about my students' moment of reading, of wanting to stop reading as a way of inhabiting a future or an afterlife different than the one that they're forced to live. And to think about it as a statement, not of a poet choosing monism over dualism, say, but rather as characteristic of what you're calling a pattern of Protestant poetry, alternating between equally orthodox ideas, as Sophie already summarized, of immortality and resurrection, and a pattern that becomes what you call an open-ended and adjustable rhythm. And it's the rhythm stuff that I found myself most moved by, because you sort of argue that it finds its way both into what you call practical devotional purposes, which is fine, I'm not interested, but also into radical poetic invention, which I'm much more interested in an anti-moderate Enlightenment vein. I love this idea, sort of an anti-moderate Enlightenment vein, hitherto really under-examined, in which poetry becomes the place of a privileged encounter with futurity. Drawing the afterlife closer to the here and now, as you write, and moving it from eternity into time so as to take hold of it through a time-bound literary experience. And that is exactly what my student, Sylvia, experienced in that moment, right? It was really what they were experiencing. And it was for me to try to catch up and try to find a way to understand what they were experiencing. So in your entirely original reading, a mortalist poetics restores the soul to its customary place in materiality, and it's the immortalists who resist the dominant strains of thought, moderating the spirit to frankly they moderate the spirit, and you're more interested in the immortalists letting its kind of freak flag fly. And there is something, for me, profoundly queer in that, and that part of the discomfort that I described at the beginning was communicated to me through queer and trans students having this experience in particular. It's what, really invited me to start thinking about this way, and why your book is so amazing. No middle flight, but rather an unbound soul granted new angelic powers of perception and self-definition. So while these poets don't have a place in most literary histories of the 18th century, disembodying poetics, as you argued, should be seen as an Enlightenment project, modern and weird, right? Craving some new experience in the connection that something might or must be ahead. I loved your idea of a re-disembodiment, a re-disembodiment still to come. Poets are able to imagine new kinds of mobile and altogether adjustable selves. And I loved your invitation to, to think with modern poets. So Jory Graham's soul walking everywhere without weight, which resonates as much with Augustine as with Milton, I think. I also love how you give us a new genealogy of Milton's sort of towering role in subsequent verse that's frankly not boring. It's often really boring, as you know, where you're paying attention rather to the angelic thinking and the poetry beyond what you call prose reason. That's Edward Young's formulation, but you do a really great job with it, particularly in Rowe's poetry, where her sort of couplets bust in, harboring this sort of disembodied poetics against the straightenings of prose reason. I really loved what you did. I hope I'm pronouncing the poet's first name right. Danes Smith's poem, his voicing, "Please don't call us dead, call us alive someplace better." And, I have a lot more to say, but I actually really want to leave it with this sort of speculative possibilities that is a kind of philosophy. I mean, one of the things that the 17th century philosophers I like Cavendish, proposed is that speculation itself is philosophy. It's ways of knowing, it's epistemologically real. They may be more in the materialist bent, right? Her idea was that ideas were as materially real as anything else, but nonetheless, the argument for a speculative is doing epistemological work that can save and make lives. So thank you so much for the amazing book. I can't wait to hear Chris now.
Thank you, Julie. Okay, Chris Brown.
Hi, thank you, Alan. Wow. All right, let me just say first that I wanted to sort of characterize my, response to the book just as a reader. I just found this as a work of scholarship, meticulous, precise, learned, rigorous, ruthless in its clarity, and often really inspiring. And so I just want to put that out there because it's just as an experience, an intellectual experience, just as a scholar, I just found it really, really satisfying, and very much worth the multiple reads that I gave it. It's a work which, repays many visits, and I hope and I expect that it will as people encounter it and work through it. I have to, I'm very much out of my element here. I'm also out of my depth. I have to sort of own up to that at the outset. More than once as I worked through the book, I could not help but feel that somebody else should be doing this job than me. And I don't just mean this from the standpoint of a kind of, false humility that some commentators, do. I mean, I've spent most of my adult life thinking about the 18th century and the British 18th century specifically. And yet I knew basically nothing about the material that this book covered, especially in its middle, substantial middle part. And even the figures that I do know something about, quite a bit about in some instances, such as Toba Cugoano or Ignatius Sancho, or William Cooper or John Newton or Phyllis Wheatley, they look so different here as for me to be almost recognizable, unrecognizable from the historical figures that I thought I knew. I mean this in a really good way, that they're unrecognizable. And I think this reveals, if nothing else, there's a substantial gap that exists between the practice of history and the practice of literature in 18th century studies. Obviously, there are many of us who cross over. I'm not one of them. I'm very much of a historian's historian. And that there are two different modes and ways of being a scholar of this era is very much, in some ways, how it should be. We have different work to do, and there is a lot of work to do. But what a difference, what difference it makes to dive into the other side. And, I couldn't help but feel a little bit like a bit of a tourist in trying to get my bearings in a territory that I thought I knew a little bit about, but was actually, deeply unfamiliar. So let me say first, though, that I found the treatment of disembodiment, re-embodiment, the oscillation between the spiritualist and the materialist positions just so captivating and so useful to think with. And also, and I think this is partially a disciplinary difference, but I don't think that's entirely it. Because I've read a fair number of sermons, for example, written by Anglican clergymen. And I read a lot of the public and private correspondence of Methodists and Anglican evangelicals in the 18th century. I spent a fair amount of time actually thinking about some of the theological positions of the period, theological disputes of the period, although not so much thinking about the place of the soul as in the way that those positions influenced, we might call, public life. But needless to say, the kind of speculations that are in this work regarding the soul are just not to be found in those kinds of materials. And I'm tempted to say that not only they cannot be found, but it's almost like they couldn't be imagined there. Although I guess it's possible that I missed them or I don't know the people that I've studied as well as I thought I did. Now, this is in large part because of generic differences. These are poems, not letters or sermons. But still, the mindset of Rowe Young and Akenside seem as if it's from another age and another culture. And I think that's the point, or I think that's one of the points. Dustin establishes the key distinction in the interlude. It's key distinction between sort of, I think of as sort of an Anglican, moderate, Enlightenment, mainstream culture, and the world that he's exploring in the heart of the book. And this really interesting interlude between the first and second parts of the book. And this is on page 73, if anybody happens to have it, where he acknowledges the shadow book that he's not written, which he describes as a story about Enlightenment poetry that could justifiably be told if the modern Enlightenment had flowed forward in an unimpeded sweep from Milton to Romanticism, and if a new push toward the spiritualist perspective with its contrary pattern hadn't intervened along the way. My larger point, though, is that it did intervene. And so the bulk of the book is then devoted to exploring and explicating that spiritualist perspective. Now, since I have no training in and no skill for literary criticism, and I have an undergraduate transcript in my files that can prove it, I think what I'm left with is a kind of vulgar materialism. And what follows is inspired by passages 2 pages before what I just read, where Dustin offers his concluding thoughts on Milton. And this really gets to the point that I most want to concentrate on. While Milton doubtless wants his readers to anticipate a resurrection to come and to sort out what such a promise can mean, and I'm quoting Dustin right now, he simultaneously encourages them to learn to live without it, building a workable existence for the indefinite meantime. It's part of this return to embodiment and finding comfort, solace there. He emerges, this is Milton, as an exemplar of what I've characterized as the moderate Enlightenment. His late work will not separate spirit from matter or leave earth for a heaven whose doors remain closed for now. Perhaps it's his hard-won presentism that may speak most resonantly to people today, who cannot foresee a mode of existence radically different from our own, and who can therefore do little better than wish for more time, more of life as it is now, or preferably more of an alternative tense that can appraise the present while still living in it. And Milton with no future might be just the poet for us. This is such an interesting statement to me. And I'm not in a position to evaluate the reading of Milton, but I do wonder about the, this closing statement, I'm just in the present might just be the poet for us, because I have to wonder who the us is, and for whom this preference to extend the present feels most urgent. Does it not depend, at least somewhat, with respect to the flight of the soul or the flight to join souls or the flight beyond souls, what one is fleeing from, and not just a mortal present, but perhaps an unhappy one? And that seems clear in the biographies of the people that were spotlighted. For Rowe, it's misogyny. For Young, it's loss and despair. For Akenside, it's alienation and aggrievement. For Wheatley, it's the status of being enslaved. And so you found the spiritualist poetic in today's Anglo-American poets. And I found this so interesting, who in three of the four instances of examples that you give, Tracy K. Smith, Dennis Smith, and Kevin Young turn out to be Black writers. So it almost comes close to implying that the subject position, one's biography, one's experience, determines, although I'm quite sure that's not the point, but there's a kind of almost an invitation to read it that way. And so I just guess I wonder what you would say to that. The linkage between experience, position, biography suggests a different kind of location as a consequence for the exemplars of the moderate Enlightenment, who quite literally are bracketed in the book at the beginning and the end. Theirs comes to seem instead like a poetics of complacency. Now, there may be a bit of stacking the deck here. I mean, I get the sense that the spiritualists, the disembodiers, the escape artists hold much more appeal for you as a critic. And there's a way I almost feel like the Milton gets set up as a kind of a contrast so that we can sort of feel that escape, that tension. You know, they emerge as not just iterators, but sources of inspiration. And I think for today, and yet we have this confession from you at the very beginning, where you say, my religious sympathies these days lie entirely with the mortalist poetics, the moderate Enlightenment. So there's a kind of a disavowal, and yet the whole spirit of the book feels like it's actually pushing the opposite direction. And so I couldn't help but wonder about that disavowal. And so, and one last point. It's hard not to read this book and its discussion of embodiment and the spirit trapped, working to get out of the soul and being pulled back in the soul, and then, I mean, in the body, and then yearning for more. And not to think of this moment of us trapped in our homes, trapped in our bodies, concerned about a kind of, you know, the sort of the physicalness that we are inhabiting right now. And also for those who do have religious and spiritual lives that are about community, that are about church, that are about spaces of gathering, the ways that the spirit has been contained and forced down within us. And so I guess the sort of the presentist position is not so much more of the same or more of the present, but a whole lot less of it.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you all. It's wonderful to have three such thorough and searching responses. I'm going to ask Dustin to respond in a minute, but I'll take this opportunity to remind anyone who wants to ask a question to this would be the moment to type it in the Q&A box. And if you wish to ask your question live, just put the word live in somewhere, and we'll try and get to as many questions as we can. But I hand it back to Dustin.
Thanks, Alan, and thanks to my co-presenters for these terrific and probing and insightful responses. I certainly can't do so much to cover all the terrain that you've mapped, but I want to hit on a few questions that you raised or observations that you made. For Sophie, I think I can start with the final reflection, and that may work its way back to one of the first questions that you raised. And your final point is this idea of identification with other bodies, identification with the body of Christ, or with the bodies of other Christians. You interestingly suggested this could encourage an understanding or conception of surrogacy, but may also mean that there's too much claim, too easy a claim made on other bodies. I guess the thing I would say there that doesn't play too big of a part in the book, but one of the curious things about the long middle section, which is focused on these 18th century figures, is that they're, reacting to a perceived, materialist threat, reacting to a sense that the very idea of the soul is being challenged, it is being jeopardized by modern thought. One of the odd things about the sort of poetic experimentation that comes from that place is that it's in a way so fixated on the soul, so obsessed with its possibility, so dreamy about what being in the soul and out of the body might mean in terms of escaping these oppressive structures that these poets associate with embodiment. I find in all of their cases that the figure of Christ and the figure of the body of Christ takes a back seat, is sometimes left out altogether. In the case of Jung's Night Thoughts, for example, it's the sort of career, the arc of the soul, the angelic soul, that kind of takes the place of the arc of the Son of God, from being a member of the Godhead to being incarnate to rising again. That story becomes like a manifestation of the soul story rather than the other way around. What this means, though, for those who, what does this mean for those who don't have a Protestant body or soul? There are no comforting answers to be drawn from the poets that I'm focusing on, except that there is a willingness on their part to extend the language, to extend the idea of a futurity beyond where a strict theological limit would keep it. So Akenside's the good figure here to think about, to think with, and the pleasures of imagination. Probably the most studied moment in that long philosophical poem is a place where the poet imagines, this process by which, seashells gradually become, over time, become angels. Akenside, riffs on this for a bit, but the idea of extending ensoulment to other creatures, to other forms of life, not just humans. It puts Akenside in some tricky, theological or religious territory, but it is, I think, the terminus toward which this kind of thinking and experimentation is going. And again, it's the position that seems like it cries out to be cast. It seems to want to be dismissed as the sort of reactionary position, right? Defending the soul, when surely they were past that by the mid-18th century. And yet the intellectual daring and the poetic daring that this position made possible is what I'm trying to recover and recuperate in that section of the book. In a way that, wasn't necessarily what I set out to do, but I want to affirm, and on this measure, Julie's point, that it's the people who are imagining disembodiment, who are imagining escaping the constraints of embodiment as they understand it, which is a kind of hellish space. It's a hell on earth for someone like Rowe. There is a way in which they're letting their freak flag fly, because it becomes a way to think, to imagine escape, to imagine a better life, but not just to sort of project it beyond death, but to insist that this kind of art makes some, foretaste of that some kind of practice in that angelic existence possible. And that sense that poetry can do it, that's sort of shrouded in anxiety too, right? These are all writers who are acutely aware that poetry might be dying just as well as the soul, right? Poetry's its own cultural traction, its own importance for cultural debates. This is becoming questioned as well. So there's a lot of pressure put on what the soul is and can do. Simultaneously, there's a lot of pressure put on what poetry is and can do. Maybe there's some special pleading there, but I think the results are pretty fascinating. I'm exceedingly grateful for Chris's thoughts, and I do feel bad that you felt like you were, reading in another language, or at least reading material that didn't fit with the 18th century as you tend to understand it, and much more about it than I do. And yet I take the compliment that the unrecognizability of even the figures you do know very well can be a good thing, can provide a different angle of vision, and this sort of back and forth interaction that we literary critics or literary historians and historians are having. yeah, I think the speculations, that's a key word for you as it was for Julie, the speculations in this poetry, yeah, probably couldn't appear in most of in the Anglican sermons you mentioned. But you're right, I'm trying to identify multiple enlightenments here, even within this, you know, broadly Protestant framework. One setting up, resolving itself into a kind of moderate and modest harmony, marriage between body and soul. Yeah, maybe there's a soul, but that should stay in its place for now. It should abide by the rules. It should be peaceable. And then this refusal of that compromise is one of the things that characterizes these poets who looked so unfamiliar, looked unfamiliar to you. Yeah, and you get around to some important stuff, Chris, at the very end, and I'll use that to come to my own end here. The moderate enlightenment can read as a sort of poetics of complacency. I think that's a fair assessment of my reading. And the curious thing about that is that, you know, Milton is writing these things from a position of defeat, from a position of loss. He's not writing them from a position of comfort. So why extend, even with, you know, whatever redemptive quality that extension, you know, could happen? Why want to extend that? I guess I would say for Milton anyway, the process of waiting has become indistinguishable from its object. I think that's language from the book that just sort of came into my head now. Has a tendency to do that. But this idea that patience is itself the practice, even if it means actually sort of creating time, creating additional time between yourself and the thing you're waiting for. That time is what devotion feels like. Certainly it's what poetry requires for someone like Milton. And then I'm grateful for asking the question about, in my introductory chapter, when I'm trying to suggest that this poetics of disembodiment doesn't simply go away. It's not defeated once and for all, but it sort of recurs and repeats even today among Black writers specifically. A couple people named Smith, for example, and a Young. I play with this comparison between Kevin Young, our own contemporary, and Edward Young from the 18th century. Yeah, surely the biographies of these poets, their subject positions, has something to do with their relation to futurity one way or the other. Several of the poets that I'm talking about, themselves don't have children. So the idea of reproductive futurity is not really foremost in their minds. But the sense that writers of color can still incorporate, can still draw upon this vision of being not dead, but alive somewhere better. That's a tool. It sounds like a trap, right? But I want to say that it's a tool that poets, including radical poets, including queer poets, including trans poets, poets of color, who find themselves outside of the poetic mainstream, are still working with. And I want to look for those places rather than to discount them from the outset. And I'll leave the question about, your words about COVID and containment. Maybe sometimes less rather than more of our actually existing present tense. That would be good.
Great. We've got some really interesting questions. I'm going to call on Seth Williams if we can get him to ask his question live. Seth, are you there?
Yes. Okay. All right. There we go. Thanks so much. Okay. Now I've got to ask a version of the questions that I typed out so eloquently in the Q&A. I think I said something like this. You're talking about rhythm in a way that, because the book is concerned with futurity, I can kind of get the temporal register that mediates the relationship between theologies with kind of competing emphases and the rhythmic possibilities of poetry. And I'm wondering if you could say more about the kind of spatial component in your thinking here, right? The futurity part clues me into all the temporal thinking, but I'm thinking about those rhythms that are seen rather than heard, or the highs and the lows that are a part of this project. I'm wondering, for example, there's a kind of, heavenward aspiration that seems key to a lot of the thinking here. I'm wondering about the antitheses of that and how that fits into the project. There's clearly a kind of spatial marginalization to some voices in verse. So it's a very open-ended question, which really just boils down to, could you say a little bit more about space in addition to time?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question, Seth. The short version is that space is reassuring for the chapter on Milton and the chapters, most of the chapters on the Romantic writers that I'm considering. But space is a problem for the poets in the middle. Space, for them relates to place, which relates to embodiment, which they see as constraint or as limit. The best figure to adduce in this example is Edward Young, whose night thoughts imagine, and this becomes a kind of recurring theme in the book. I'm quoting Young, a futurity forever future. So there's heavenward aspiration, as you say, nicely, but there's also the recognition that heaven seems spatial. And so to get there means that you've lost the thing that made the experience great, which is actually the leaving. So heaven becomes for Young, and I think implicitly for some of these other figures, an infinite series of heavens rather than a single one. You can't escape space, and one way that Young addresses this is by thinking about planets, but associating planets with different sort of tutelary spirits, different angels presiding over them. So actually going out into the cosmos for Young is not something that you can map or track physically, but you're actually sort of stretching into angelic realms, and in a way going from mind to mind rather than from place to place. I hope that answers at least some of your question.
Well, moving from space to time, Joanna Stalacker asks, my question is whether part of your story has to do with changing conceptions of time due to the imaginative leap into the deep history of the earth, as opposed to foreshortened biblical histories and chronologies. She also says lots of nice things about the book, but that's the question.
I'll insist that Alan tell me those nice things at some later point. Yeah, I don't, it's in a way connected to Seth's question, the idea of whether developments in say, geology, debates about fossils, right, might sort of factor into this. And I guess for the poets that I'm focusing on, certainly the temporal scale is expanded. They are trying in what at the moment feels like a new way. They are trying to think the infinite. But part of the criterion for selection of inclusion of these poets is that they tend to sort of take those glasses forward. They tend to look through these goggles ahead rather than behind, or they tend to and this is something that Lovejoy picked up on, identifying Akenside and Young, quite some time ago now, almost 100 years ago now, as temporalizing the chain of being, that the chain of being itself was more like an escalator, right? That gradually rose, and this is one way that Lovejoy can make sense of Akenside on seashells. So yeah, if that's the link to fossils and geological time, I do think there is an expansion in a way. It's motivated by that development. It's motivated by broader access to telescopes, probably. And yet there's also an attempt to fit a more familiar notion of disembodiment, the soul leaving from the space of the body onto that new and developing framework.
Okay, I have a question from Michael Krzyzanowski. He says, Professor Dustin Stewart is the best teacher I've had at Columbia. So you wanted the compliments, you get them. Question for you. How do you think that maybe for Chris, how do you think that historians can have an interdisciplinary approach with the English field?
Yeah, Michael is himself a master's student in history. Maybe I'll let Chris start and I'll see if there's anything I can add, which probably won't be much.
There's an ambulance going by on Amsterdam Avenue, so sorry for the background noise. You know, I hope my comments did not come as I didn't intend them to sound troubled. I actually think that there are really important, you know, points of intersection, but I also just found the analysis and the readings and the attention of a kind that historians do not typically do so rewarding, so fascinating, and so in some ways sometimes jarring, that it had the effect of kind of tilting things and making, for example, the Anglican mainstream, which I know a lot about, seem like one, you know, just as this thing that's missing these other things that are happening alongside. So, you know, and the fact of the matter is that, you know, literary criticism in the 18th century has paid far more attention to history than the other way around. So, you know, I realize this as a kind of a gesture of respect for all of the skills that you all have that we don't learn. And I think that there is a lot to learn. And so, you know, that's the spirit from which I made those observations. I also say, you know, the 18th century is kind of suspended between the early modern and the modern, and it's just kind of, you know, it's kind of often a poor stepchild to both. And, you know, I think one of the things that this has really left me thinking about is just how rich the 18th century is, and that one can be working on the same period with entirely different questions and peoples and to not have any sense of each other. And that just, I think, speaks to its expanse, its vastness. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just add that probably one of the impediments to that that cross-disciplinary dialogue is the role of the reading for literary critics. You know, readings of poems, readings of novels. It depends on which critic you ask, but you know, what's the purpose of those? What are those for? Are those sufficient unto themselves, or are they meant to be put to the purpose of some larger claim about cultural history? You know, if that's right? If the goal is to do readings for the sake of making, you know, larger arguments about the history of culture, then probably one of the things that's difficult is that the evidentiary burden on readings for the literary critic is something that historians probably struggle with or find that they just don't need. Yeah, but not all historians.
Okay, from history to theology then. James Wood says, I'm interested in the rhythm between spiritualist and materialist conceptions of the afterlife in one life or one mind. Am I right, he says, in associating this with the Aquinian dialectic, a more inchoate version perhaps?
The place of Aquinas, where can Aquinas go? Aquinas can actually be a point of resistance, and that would go like this. For Thomas, the people that I know who study Aquinas are on a first name basis with him, so I've just adopted that. For Thomas, yes, it's conceptually, theoretically, philosophically possible that a human soul can live apart for a time from a human body. And that seems to be the way it works. And yet, human souls / minds aren't meant to live apart from human bodies. We're not angels, we're human beings. Consequently, that sort of state of separation, that intermediate state, is a kind of deprivation there's something missing. It's not possible to be fully human in that realm. The poets that I'm working with are, building on what's probably more like a Cambridge Platonist sense of the possibility of the soul gaining momentum, gaining power, becoming more like the angelic spirit upon its escape from the body. In that respect, it's not orthodox, and that's maybe one of the things I should have said from the outset, is that I'm trying to kind of map these different poets in relation to a standard orthodox picture of what the afterlife looks like, and yet neither of these camps that I'm trying to establish can be reduced to that orthodox picture. They both take some element of it and kind of go wild with it in a way that takes them beyond any kind of moderate compromise.
Okay, one last question, I think. It's one that looks to your futurity. Molly Murray says, I have a question that strictly speaking goes beyond this book, but it's sparked by the respondents' references to queer bodies, bodies of color, differently abled bodies, etc. Could Dustin talk a bit about his ELH article, or indeed his new book project on the parish? How are these projects linked to the concerns of this book on futures, bodies, souls?
In a way, the new material that I'm working on at the moment, it actually, in some ways, it responds to earlier questions in the Q&A about how all this relates to space. I am thinking more specifically. I'm thinking more specifically about bodies in space, and trying to think more in local terms. As you've heard, I've been trying to conceptualize how 18th century figures have been, thinking well beyond the present. This brings us back actually to one of Sophie's points, that presence or presentness is itself vexed. So as I'm moving ahead, I'm actually trying to think more about nature, more about local space, more about the parish boundary is especially interesting to me because there is this, overt, straightforward, political dimension. The idea of local governance overlaps with an idea of church authority and the structure of the state church from the first. So there's not really a need to negotiate some kind of sophisticated or problematic understanding of secularization when the secular and the ecclesial were working together from the outset. So that's where I'm taking this next project. And theologically speaking, I'm really interested in imminence. I'm interested, to put it briefly, I'm interested less in angels and more of other bodies or say birds as themselves angelic. So without knowing it, I've been responding as I've been generating ideas for the next project to questions that I've been asked tonight, and I'll be excited, but also a little anxious to hear how Chris responds to a work of mine on Kugawano that cites him at numerous points. Trying to think about Kugawano and his connection to Calvinism, trying to think through whether there's such a thing as Black Calvinism, whether that's conceivable, and the frame for that, and this is sort of a standalone piece. The frame for that is whether the Afro-pessimism of the present can be placed into a genealogy that reaches back to include late 18th century Calvinism, a kind of Calvinism that seems to have outlived its moment, a Calvinism that seems to have a strangely long afterlife.
Thank you for all your questions, everyone. Thank you to our panelists, Sophie G, Julie Crawford, Christopher Brown, and especially to Dustin. And congratulations again on Futures of Enlightenment Poetry. in the chat, there is a 30% off code you can use on the OUP website. So it really is, as you've probably gathered from all the responses tonight, this is an extremely rich book that I think we're going to be living with for quite some time. So thank you all. Thank you for coming. Keep warm, and I'll see you all soon.